They saw things no human should see, but it wasn't the bombs, the flak, or the enemy aces that broke them. It was the silence. The silence after the destruction. This is the classified truth American pilots carried home from the skies above a shattered world. We honor the heroism of the airmen who flew in the great conflicts of the 20th century, men who faced unimaginable terror in the high-altitude battlegrounds. But there is a dark, heavy chapter in the history of aerial warfare that rarely gets told, a chapter written not in the roar of machine guns, but in the quiet, desperate confessions made decades after the warplanes landed for the final time. It is the story of what happens when the warrior achieves victory only to realize he has become the sole witness to a geological-scale catastrophe wrought by his own hands. This is the story of the view from 30,000 feet and the burden of total annihilation. The strategic bombing campaigns of World War II were predicated on a simple, terrifying calculation. If you destroy the enemy's ability to produce, you destroy their will to fight. American and British air forces dropped millions of tons of high explosives and incendiaries across Europe and the Pacific. The pilots tasked with executing this strategy were trained rigorously in navigation, combat, and maintaining the B-17s and B-29s under intense pressure. They were not trained, however, for the sheer psychological devastation of seeing what they had done. The immediate confession of many pilots upon returning from a mission over a target like Cologne or Hamburg was focused on the technical difficulties, the heavy flak, the evasive maneuvers, the sheer cold of the upper atmosphere. But beneath the technical jargon and the bravado of the briefing rooms lay a creeping, corrosive horror. For most of the mission, the target was just a map coordinate, a geometric shape seen through a Norden bomb sight. The men who dropped the bombs lived inside a shell of steel and altitude, protected from the immediate consequences. But that protection vanished the moment they turned the aircraft around and looked back. Pilot Arthur Harris, flying a routine daylight mission over Germany in 1944, recounted in a suppressed interview years later that the clouds of smoke rising from the targeted city weren't gray or black, as propaganda showed. They were pulsing. They were the color of dying embers, edged with an unnatural red glow. "We were told we were hitting factories, marshalling yards," Harris said, and we did. But when we circled back over the Rhine, the smoke column wasn't just industrial smoke. It was shaped like a massive mushroom cloud, but rising from the ground, not expanding from above. It reached up to our altitude, dirty and suffocating. You realized instantly that everything beneath that cloud was now gone. Not damaged, gone. The sheer scale of the destruction over cities like Hamburg in 1943, where the firestorm consumed an estimated 40,000 lives in a single night, generated a unique aerial phenomenon. The heat was so intense, it created its own weather system, sucking in oxygen from the surrounding areas and creating updrafts that could shake the heavy bombers thousands of feet above. Many pilots confessed that they didn't see individual buildings or streets. What they saw was geography itself melting. They spoke of the target area as a newly formed geological feature, a vast, flat, smoking caldera where a civilization had existed hours before. It was the transition from civilization to lunar landscape that left the first indelible psychological scar. The true weight of the confession begins when we move beyond the heat of battle and consider the reconnaissance flights and the follow-up supply runs. The fighting men had the adrenaline and the mission urgency to keep their focus narrow. But the men who flew over these cities days, weeks, and months later, when the dust had settled and the fires had dimmed, were witnesses, not combatants. Their confessions centered on the silence. Flying over the ruins of Dresden, post-February 1945, Lieutenant Robert Clark, a photo reconnaissance pilot, described the city not as ruins, but as ash reorganized into piles. It looked like someone had taken a pencil and completely erased the life off the map, Clark wrote in a private journal entry discovered by his family decades later. You could map the original streets, yes, The geometric layout of the city was still there, but every structure was flattened to the same height. It was geometric ruin. We flew low for better photographs, and the air below us felt dead. There was no traffic, no movement, no smoke from cooking, no hint of humanity. It was the sound of our engines echoing over total silence that made me sick. It was the sound of absence. This view led to the first layer of confessed trauma, the overwhelming realization of the efficacy of their weapons. They had executed a mission so perfectly, so thoroughly, that they had accidentally stepped outside the moral constraints of traditional warfare. They hadn't defeated the enemy, they had sterilized the ground. If these untold histories resonate with you, take a moment to hit the like button. It helps us ensure these vital, difficult stories are never forgotten, buried under the rubble of history. The airmen were trained to view the targets as strategic assets. A bridge was a supply route. A factory was a source of tanks. But what they confessed to struggling with was the shift in perspective once they landed. Back on the base, surrounded by camaraderie and celebration, the cognitive dissonance began its slow, destructive work. Pilot confessions often revolved around the sudden inability to reconcile the professional satisfaction of a successful mission with the horrifying image burned into their minds. They had executed their duty flawlessly, yet they felt like perpetrators of an inexplicable crime. Many pilots, particularly those involved in the later phases of the bombing campaigns over Japan, spoke of a unique smell that permeated the high altitudes above the burning cities. It wasn't the smell of gunpowder or aviation fuel. It was the smell of widespread combustion mixed with density of life, the smell of humanity on fire. This visceral, primal sensory memory was impossible to shake. In the Pacific Theater, the firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 was arguably the single most destructive air raid in history. The B-29 pilots, flying the largest bombers of the war, dropped massive amounts of M69 incendiary clusters over dense wooden housing districts. The result was a conflagration that killed over 100,000 people and incinerated 16 square miles of the city. One American navigator, flying the lead aircraft that night, admitted in a private letter to his chaplain that the sight transcended war. "We weren't fighting soldiers anymore," he wrote. "We were fighting a city, and the city was fighting back with fire, heat, and smoke." The confession I carry is that I saw Tokyo turn into a lake of flame, and for a moment I didn't feel like an American airman. I felt like a mythological demon, dropping fire onto the earth. The guilt was compounded by the distance. It was an antiseptic form of killing. Unlike the infantryman who faced the enemy eye to eye, the airman was detached, the destruction delayed. This detachment was necessary for the job, but it was also the breeding ground for post-traumatic stress. When the detachment broke down, usually on the long, silent flight back to base, the full weight of the carnage rushed in. The military, in the immediate post-war years, focused heavily on minimizing these psychological burdens. Pilots were heroes. They were essential to victory. Admitting the horror meant admitting the moral ambiguity of the strategic campaigns, something the victorious powers were not ready to do. Thus, the confessions remained private, buried in veterans groups, in therapy sessions disguised as routine checkups, and in the archives of chaplains. One common confession was the recurring nightmare of sound. Not the sound of the planes, but the sound that must have been happening below them. The screams, the crashing timber, the roar of the fire. The pilots knew they were too high to hear it, but their minds compensated, filling the void with the auditory horror of what they had created. This psychological mechanism is known today as moral injury. The trauma incurred from perpetrating, failing to prevent, or bearing witness to acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs. These pilots were asked to transgress their moral code for the sake of victory, and their minds never fully forgave them. The transition to the nuclear age intensified these burdens exponentially. The men who flew the Enola Gay and Boxcar missions over Hiroshima and Nagasaki carried a weight incomparable to any other combatants in history. They had delivered ultimate destruction, transforming cities into shadows in an instant. Major Charles Sweeney, pilot of Boxcar, the plane that dropped the bomb on Nagasaki, described the mushroom cloud not just as destructive, but as beautiful. This description, common among those who witnessed the atomic blasts, often confused the public. But the pilots confessed that the beauty was part of the terror. It was the aesthetic perfection of total annihilation. It was the spectacle of physics ending existence. When Sweeney and his crew returned, they were hailed as saviors. But their personal confession was always darker. They knew they had crossed a final boundary. They had delivered a weapon that made the firebombing of Tokyo seem like minor property damage. Decades later, many of these men spoke of a profound sense of isolation. How could they explain to their wives and children what they had seen? How could they explain the moment they saw the world reduced to dust and light and felt nothing but the professional satisfaction of a completed run? The confessions often manifest as seemingly trivial details. One pilot who flew over Hiroshima 3 days after the bombing confessed to an obsession with geometry. He couldn't stand curved lines. He admitted that the only thing that felt safe or logical was the perfect flat plane of the city's impact radius, a smooth, clean circle of destruction that his mind had accepted as the only true order. This is the hidden cost of the air war. The pilots, by necessity, had to become machines of efficiency, dehumanizing the target. But they were still men, and the universe refused to let the consequences stay impersonal. The consequences climbed 30,000 feet, infiltrated the cockpit, and settled deep into their souls. Now, let's consider the post-war phase. As the war ended, American pilots shifted from delivering destruction to delivering aid and supplies. They flew C-47s over the same routes, now carrying food, medical supplies, and reconstruction materials. This contrast was devastating. Pilot John Rourke, flying relief supplies into Berlin in 1946, confessed that seeing the survivors living amongst the ruins was far more emotionally crushing than seeing the ruins themselves during wartime. During the war, the city was dead from above, just charcoal and smoke, Rourke recounted. It was abstract. But flying low over the ruins now, I saw people, children. They were starving, they were injured, they were ghosts in the rubble. And I knew, fundamentally, that my aircraft had contributed to their hell. We were dropping food onto the landscape we had helped create. It was a cycle of sin and repentance that never seemed to end. The confessions of the relief pilots underscore a deeper psychological truth. The detachment required for aerial bombardment is unsustainable when confronted with the human reality of the consequences. The moment the targets turned back into people, the trauma became acute. The Air Force recognized the need for psychological support, though often termed fatigue management or morale boosting. Yet, the prevailing culture was one of stoicism. Pilots were expected to compartmentalize the horror. This suppression is why many of the most moving confessions didn't surface until the 1970s and 1980s, prompted by the anniversaries of the war or the death of a comrade. Many pilots reported a recurring dream involving the smell of burning wood and dust, coupled with the strange sound of concrete buckling. These were the phantom sensations of the firestorm they witnessed from afar. They were carrying the sensory echoes of mass death, even if their bodies hadn't been physically present in the inferno. One particularly poignant confession came from a former B-17 co-pilot involved in raids over the Ruhr Valley. He admitted that for 20 years after the war, he could not look at a detailed map of Europe without his heart pounding. The map was the crime scene, he explained. It was the place where the abstraction turned into reality. Every dot on the map wasn't just a place where people lived. It was a place where I helped commit an act of mass destruction. I used to stare at the small, dark patches, and I could feel the heat radiating from them, even decades later. The psychological effect of the strategic bombing campaigns forced a re-evaluation of warfare ethics, even if that re-evaluation happened quietly in the minds of the men who flew the missions. They were the first generation of warriors to truly wrestle with the concept of push-button annihilation, where the human cost was measured in square miles of erased cities, not miles gained on the ground. The American pilot, flying high above the clouds, was meant to be the detached deliverer of justice. What he confessed to becoming was the reluctant witness to the end of a world. This role of witness was ultimately more damaging than the role of combatant. The concept of the 1,000-yard stare is usually associated with ground troops overwhelmed by the immediate horrors of trench warfare or close combat. But high-altitude pilots developed their own version, a distant, vacant look born from surveying too much death from too far away. They saw the end of the line, and they couldn't unsee it. The long-term effects of these suppressed confessions included high rates of alcoholism, marital breakdown, and severe insomnia among veterans who refused to seek help, fearing that admitting the moral injury would taint their combat record and the national narrative of victory. They confessed that the victory felt hollow because the emptiness they created in the air above Europe and Japan mirrored the emptiness they felt inside. The legacy of these airmen is not just in the medals they earned, but in the quiet, desperate truths they tried to communicate about the true nature of modern warfare. They flew the missions that ended the war, but they paid a steep psychological price for the view they had on the return flight. The stories we've uncovered today represent decades of silence. If you feel this kind of deep dive into forgotten history deserves preservation, subscribe now and join our community. Every subscriber ensures we can keep searching for the truth that lies just beneath the official narrative. The final, most profound confession shared by the surviving pilots, particularly those who flew into their 90s, was not about guilt, but about realization. They realized that the true power of their weapons wasn't just in the explosion, but in the memory of the landscape they left behind. They were haunted, not by the faces of the enemy, but by the absence of faces. They confessed that the real horror of flying over destroyed cities was understanding, in the quiet solitude of the cockpit, that they hadn't just bombed targets. They had wiped away entire universes of existence, and the silence that followed was proof that those universes were never coming back. It is a confession that reminds us that in the age of aerial warfare, the distance between the perpetrator and the consequence may widen, but the burden of witness remains terrifyingly close. The ghosts of the ruined cities ride home on the wings of the bombers, settling into the souls of the men who flew them, a permanent scar on the memory of modern conflict.